By the time I was 26, I had lost everything that was supposed to be mine. My father's company, my childhood home, the trust fund I was promised the day I was born, all of it stripped away, signed over, erased, and the worst part, the person who did it was sitting at my father's funeral, crying real tears, wearing a black dress she bought with my money. But here's what she didn't know. My father left me something she could never touch. Not money, not property, a letter and a plan. And by the time it was over, she didn't just lose everything she stole from me. She lost everything she had ever built too. This is the story of how I became the heir my family tried to erase, and how I made sure every single one of them remembered it. Let's go back to the beginning. My name is Daniel Calloway, and for the first 18 years of my life, I had what most people would call a charmed existence. My father, Robert Calloway, built a real estate development firm from nothing, literally nothing. He started with a $4,000 loan from his own mother, a woman who worked 2 jobs her entire life to give him a chance. By the time I was born, that $4,000 had become a company worth close to $40 million. We lived in a beautiful home in Connecticut. I had my own car at 16, private school, summers in Maine. The whole picture, but there were cracks. My parents' marriage was never what it looked like from the outside. My mother passed away when I was 9, a car accident on a rainy Tuesday in November, and something in my father died with her that day. He was never the same, quieter, more distant. He threw himself into work. For a few years, it was just the 2 of us. And honestly, those were good years. Hard, but good. Every Sunday we'd drive to my grandmother's house, his mother, Nana Ruth, and she'd cook enough food for a small army. My father would sit at her kitchen table and actually breathe for a few hours. Then, when I was 14, he met Sandra. Sandra Lee was 41, divorced and, as she liked, to tell anyone who would listen, a lifestyle consultant. She had blonde highlights, perfect posture, and a way of looking at you like she was calculating exactly what you were worth. My father was smitten within weeks. I did not like Sandra from the first moment I met her. It wasn't jealousy. I want to be clear about that. It was instinct. The kind of instinct that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up when something is wrong, but you can't name it yet. She was too smooth, too agreeable, too interested in my father's business meetings, his portfolio, his estate plans. But I was 14, and my father was happy, or something that looked like happy. They married 18 months later. Sandra had a daughter from her first marriage, Brittany, 2 years older than me. Brittany was everything Sandra groomed her to be. Pretty in a calculated way, charming when she needed to be, and absolutely ruthless underneath it all. From day one, Brittany made it clear she saw me as an obstacle, not a stepbrother. An obstacle. Over the next 4 years, Sandra worked on my father the way water works on rock, slowly, patiently, without him ever noticing. She started small. A comment here, a suggestion there. She'd mention how distracted I seemed at dinner, wonder aloud if I was really committed to the future of the company. She'd point out Brittany's business instincts, which, to be clear, consisted of Brittany occasionally asking my father questions she'd clearly rehearsed with Sandra beforehand. My father started pulling away from me, or maybe Sandra pulled him. Either way, the gap grew. By the time I turned 18 and left for college, the dynamic in that house had fully shifted. Sandra and Brittany had built a life around my father, his routine, his preferences, his trust, and I was the outsider. I told myself it was fine. I had a scholarship. I had my own ambitions. I'd come back and prove myself. I called my father every Sunday. Same as always. Our conversations got shorter. He always sounded tired. I'd ask about work. He'd give me vague answers. I'd ask about Nana Ruth, and he'd say she was fine, always fine. What I didn't know, what nobody told me, was that my father had been diagnosed with early stage Parkinson's disease during my sophomore year. Nobody called me. not my father, not Sandra, not even Nana Ruth, who I found out later had been forbidden from contacting me by Sandra, who had told her it would upset Daniel's studies. I found out at Christmas when I came home, and my father shook my hand instead of hugging me, and I felt his tremors for the first time. I pulled Sandra aside and asked why she hadn't told me. She gave me the most sympathetic smile you've ever seen and said, "We didn't want to worry you, sweetheart. Robert wanted to handle it himself." That was the first lie I could prove asterisk. I know because later, going through old emails, I found one where Sandra had written to my father's attorney a week after the diagnosis asking about estate restructuring options. In light of Robert's changing medical situation, my father wasn't even 3 months into his diagnosis, and Sandra was already talking to lawyers about his estate, but I didn't know that yet. What I did know was that something was very wrong. So I finished my degree, moved back to Connecticut, and started paying attention. What I discovered over the next 2 years shook me to my core. Sandra had not been idle. While I was at college, she had systematically worked to reposition herself as the center of my father's world. She managed his medications. She drove him to appointments. She coordinated with his business partners, slowly inserting herself into meetings, phone calls, decisions. She had also, I came to learn, become very close with my father's attorney, a man named Gerald Pruitt. I later found out Sandra and Gerald had known each other for years, long before she met my father. They'd grown up in the same town in Ohio. Then came the day that changed everything. 6 months after I moved back home, my father called me into his study. He was having a good day. His hands were steadier. His voice was clear. He sat me down, and he told me that he had made some changes to his estate plan. He said Sandra had helped him think through what made the most sense long term. He said the company would be placed in a trust managed jointly by Sandra and Brittany. I would receive a generous cash payout, he said, $250,000. $250,000 from a company worth $40 million. I sat very still. I asked him if he understood what he was saying. He told me. Sandra had explained it was the most equitable arrangement. He looked tired and a little confused, and I realized with a cold certainty that he was not fully tracking what he had just told me. I didn't argue. Not then. I hugged my father, told him I loved him, and walked out of that study. And then I called Nana Ruth. Nana Ruth was 81 years old and sharp as a tack. She had watched the same thing I had watched. She had tried, in her quiet way, to warn my father. She had been shut out, managed, redirected by Sandra with a politeness so precise it was almost impressive. But Nana Ruth had done something Sandra never anticipated. She had stayed close to my father in secret, not behind Sandra's back. She couldn't manage that. But she had visited him on Tuesday afternoons when Sandra went to her Pilates class. And during those visits, she and my father had talked, really talked. She handed me an envelope the day I came to see her. My father had given it to her 8 months earlier. During one of those Tuesday visits, on the front, in his handwriting, it said, "For Daniel, when the time comes." Inside was a letter, 4 pages, handwritten, and it changed everything. My father knew what was happening. He was not as confused as Sandra believed. He had watched Sandra and Gerald Pruitt work together. He had noticed the estate changes being suggested, delayed, revised. He had even, he wrote, found a document on Sandra's laptop open. On the kitchen table, that was a draft amendment to his will, written by Gerald Pruitt, that left me nothing. But here's the twist. My father was afraid. His health was declining. He was dependent on Sandra for daily care. He was worried that if he confronted her, she would leave, and he genuinely could not manage alone. He was also, he admitted with what I could only imagine was tremendous shame, afraid of being seen as a fool who had been manipulated by the woman he married. So he did what he could. He told Nana Ruth everything, and he told her where to find what she would need in a safety deposit box at a bank in New Haven, a bank. Sandra knew nothing about, at a branch he had visited alone during a doctor's appointment. 2 years earlier, my father had placed a second will, a real one, drafted by a different attorney, an old friend of his named Marcus Webb, who had nothing to do with Gerald Pruitt. In that will, the company was mine. The house was mine. Sandra received a fair inheritance. He was not a cruel man, but she did not receive control of his life's work, and it had been sitting there, waiting. My father passed away 14 months later. Sandra cried at the funeral. Brittany held her hand. Gerald Pruitt stood near the back. I stood next to Nana Ruth and held her hand, and I was very, very calm, because I had spent 14 months preparing. With Marcus Webb's help, I had gathered everything. The draft will on Sandra's laptop, which my father had photographed. Sandra's early emails to Gerald Pruitt. Documentation showing Gerald had coordinated estate changes without my father's full informed consent during a period when his cognitive function was measurably compromised. We had medical records supporting this. 3 weeks after the funeral, when Sandra and Gerald Pruitt presented the revised will in probate court, the one that gave Sandra and Brittany control of the company, Marcus Webb stood up, and he presented the second will. Gerald Pruitt went pale. Sandra gripped Brittany's arm. The legal battle lasted 8 months. Sandra hired 3 different attorneys. She claimed the second will was fraudulent. She claimed my father had not been of sound mind. She claimed I had manipulated Nana Ruth. Every single claim collapsed. Because my father had been meticulous, the second will was witnessed by 2 attorneys, notarized and dated clearly, within a window when his medical records showed he was cognitively stable. His letter to me, authenticated by a handwriting expert, laid out exactly what he knew and why he had acted in secret. And Gerald Pruitt, facing his own bar complaint for his role in the estate manipulation, ultimately cooperated with our legal team. Sandra and Brittany walked away with exactly what my father had intended them to receive in the legitimate will, a fair sum, enough to live on, not a penny more. The company was mine. People ask me sometimes if I feel satisfied, if the revenge felt as good as I imagined it would. The honest answer is, it felt quiet, not explosive, not triumphant, just quiet, like a long exhale after holding your breath for years. Sandra moved to Florida within 6 months of the settlement. I have not spoken to her since. Brittany reached out once, about a year later, a long email, mostly about how she had been a victim of her mother's choices and how she hoped we could build a relationship going forward. I read it carefully, and then I closed my laptop and took Nana Ruth to dinner. I run the company now. We have 31 employees. We just completed a development project my father had been dreaming about for 12 years, affordable housing units in the same Connecticut town where he grew up broke. I named the building after my grandmother. Her name is on a bronze plaque by the front door, and every time I drive past it, I think about my father sitting at her kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, finally able to breathe. He didn't get to fight for himself, but he trusted me enough to fight for him. That's the inheritance that actually mattered. If this story hit you, you already know what to do. Subscribe. Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if you know someone who's been quietly fighting a battle like this, share this with them. Sometimes just knowing someone else made it through is enough. I'll see you in the next one.